I always thought I was comfortable with solitude, living alone, being by myself. It never scared me. That was until I moved into that house. It was an old place on the outskirts of town, a two-story building that had stood empty for years. I found it by chance. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, given the size of the property. But it had charm, the sort of old-world elegance that made it feel almost stately. I thought it would be the perfect place to start over. The first night passed uneventfully. I spent the evening unpacking, arranging my books on the dusty shelves, and making a simple dinner. The house was quiet, almost unnaturally so, but I told myself that's what I had wanted. Peace, solitude, a place to think. I tried not to notice the faint smell of mildew that lingered in the air, or the way the floorboards creaked underfoot, as if the house itself were waking up. It was only when I lay down to sleep that I began to feel truly uneasy. I dismissed it as first-night jitters. After all, it was a new place, and it always took a while to adjust. I shut my eyes, willing myself to relax, and then I heard it. A low murmur, like the sound of distant voices drifting through the walls. At first I thought it was the wind, but then the voices seemed to grow clearer, as if coming closer. I strained to make out what they were saying, but the words were muffled, distorted. Just whispers, really. I sat up, holding my breath, and listened. But as soon as I focused, the voices seemed to stop, as if they knew I was listening. I shook my head and lay back down, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew I had heard something. The next morning, I shrugged it off. I had slept fitfully, but I blamed it on the unfamiliar bed, the strange surroundings. I spent the day getting more settled, bringing in furniture, and trying to make the place feel like home. By the time evening came, I felt more at ease. The house seemed almost welcoming in the daylight. But when night fell, the atmosphere changed. I was lying in bed again when I heard it. The same low, murmuring voices. They were louder this time, clearer. I could almost make out words, fragments of sentences that sent a shiver down my spine. "He's here," one seemed to say. "Why is he alone?" another murmured. My pulse quickened. I sat up, clutching the sheets, and turned on the bedside lamp. The room was empty, of course, just me, alone in the big old house. But the voices continued, drifting through the walls like smoke. I threw off the covers and stood up, determined to find the source. I searched the house from top to bottom, checking every room, every corner. But there was no one there, no sign of anyone but myself. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, a heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. That night, I barely slept. By the third night, the voices were back, louder and more insistent. I could hear them clearly now, a chorus of whispers that seemed to echo through the empty halls. I tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the old house settling. But deep down, I knew. I knew that something was wrong. It was around midnight when I heard the footsteps, soft, deliberate steps, padding down the hallway outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest. I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, every nerve on edge, waiting. And then slowly, the door began to creak open. I jumped out of bed, my pulse racing. But when I flung the door wide, there was no one there. Just the empty hallway stretching out into the darkness. The house was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I laughed shakily, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid, but as I turned to go back to bed, I noticed something strange, the shadow under the door. It was darker, thicker than it should have been, and then it moved. I stumbled back, staring in horror as the shadow seemed to slither, creeping along the floor like a living thing. I yanked the door open, desperate to find the source, but there was nothing, just emptiness. From that night on, things only got worse. The whispers turned into voices, clearer and more malevolent. I started making out phrases, words that sent chills down my spine. "He doesn't belong here. We should show him." And then one night, I woke up to find the bedroom door wide open. I knew I had closed it. I always closed it. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the open door, dread coiling in my stomach. And then I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing just beyond the threshold. It was barely visible in the darkness, a silhouette of shadow and malice. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I lay there, paralyzed, as the figure slowly stepped back, melting into the shadows. The door swung shut on its own, leaving me alone in the dark. The next day, I decided to research the house's history. I needed to know what was happening, to understand the malevolent presence that seemed to be haunting me. I found an old newspaper article about a family who had lived there decades ago. The father had gone mad, driven insane by what he claimed were whispering voices. He had ended his life in the very room I was sleeping in. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The air felt heavy, thick with unseen malice. The whispers were back, louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from all around me, filling the room, chanting my name over and over. And then, clear as day, I heard a voice speak directly into my ear. "Get out." I couldn't take it anymore. I leaped out of bed and ran for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The lights flickered, and I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned around. The figure was there, standing in the corner, its face hidden in shadow. It seemed taller now, looming over me. And then, in a low, guttural voice, it whispered, "You shouldn't be alone." Panic surged through me. I shoved past it, feeling a cold, clammy touch brush against my arm. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I was several blocks away, gasping for breath. I didn't go back. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. The house still stands there, empty and waiting. Sometimes I drive by, just to see it. And every time, I get the same feeling. A sense of eyes watching from the windows, shadows shifting just beyond the glass. I never slept alone again after that. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up to the sound of whispers drifting through the walls of wherever I'm staying. Low, indistinct murmurs that seem to say, "He's still alone. Let's show him." And I know they're still waiting. Let me know what you think. It started the day I moved into my new apartment. I had always been one to seek solitude. I liked the quiet, the peace of mind that came from being alone. The studio was small but cozy, nestled on the 4th floor of a century-old building. The rent was affordable, and though the place had a few quirks, like uneven floors and drafty windows, I thought I'd make it work. But it wasn't long before I began to feel uneasy about sleeping alone there. It began with little things. Strange noises in the night, the sensation of being watched. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was new to the place, and every old building has its creaks and groans. I unpacked my things, arranged my books on the sagging shelves, and tried to ignore the sense of something being off. By the 3rd night, I started noticing other peculiarities. I would hear footsteps pacing the hallway outside my door, always around the same time, just after midnight. I'd sit up, straining to listen, but as soon as I moved, the footsteps would stop. And when I gathered the courage to peek outside, the hallway was always empty. Old pipes, I told myself, just the sound of the building settling. But that explanation felt thin, even to me. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like the faint skittering of a mouse. I lay there holding my breath, staring up at the ceiling. The scratching continued, a steady rhythmic sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. I turned on the light, my pulse racing, and the noise stopped instantly. I checked the walls, the floorboards, even the closet, but found nothing. No signs of rodents, no loose nails or cracks that could account for the noise. I went back to bed, heart pounding, and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to return. The next morning I felt foolish. It was just the wind, or maybe a neighbor moving around in the unit above. I went about my day as usual, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that seemed to hang over the apartment. But the scratching came back the next night, And the night after that, always the same soft, insistent sound, always just loud enough to keep me awake. I tried earplugs, but I could still feel the noise vibrating through the mattress, reverberating in my bones. I told my landlord about it, but he just shrugged. "This building's been around for a long time," he said. "It's full of strange noises. You'll get used to it." But I didn't get used to it. If anything, the noises only got worse. One night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing. It was faint but unmistakable, a slow, labored rasping coming from somewhere in the room. I lay there, frozen, every muscle tensed. I could feel my skin prickle, a cold sweat breaking out along my spine. I turned my head slowly, eyes straining in the dark. The breathing grew louder, filling the silence of the room. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I clutched the blankets, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I whispered. The breathing stopped. Silence pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. I didn't dare move, didn't even blink. I just lay there, waiting, listening. And then the door creaked open. It was only an inch, just enough for a thin sliver of light to spill into the room. But that was enough. I sat up, trembling, and stared at the gap, half expecting to see a face peering through. But there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching out into the darkness. I got up slowly, my movements stiff and jerky. I tiptoed to the door and pulled it open, my pulse roaring in my ears. The hallway was deserted. No sign of anyone, no sounds other than the faint hum of the building's old radiators. I shut the door, locked it, and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. Then I climbed back into bed and spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to the silence. After that, things began to escalate. I'd find objects moved when I woke up in the morning. A book that had been on the shelf now lying open on the floor, a glass tipped over on the counter. One night, I woke to find my closet door wide open, though I knew I'd closed it before going to bed. Another time, I woke to the distinct sensation of someone tugging at the sheets, as if trying to pull them off me. But the worst part was the dreams. They started out vague and disjointed, just flashes of dark shapes and muffled voices. But as the nights wore on, they grew more vivid, more disturbing. I'd find myself standing in the middle of my room, unable to move, as a shadowy figure watched me from the corner. I could never see its face, just a dark outline, impossibly tall and thin. It would stand there, silent and unmoving, as I struggled to scream, to run, to do anything, and then I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, the room empty and still. One night I woke to the sensation of a cold hand resting on my ankle. I jerked awake, heart pounding, and kicked out blindly. But there was nothing there, just the faint echo of the touch lingering on my skin, icy and insistent. I scrambled out of bed, turning on every light in the apartment, but I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I started sleeping with the lights on, a futile attempt to keep the darkness at bay. But the figure didn't care about the light. It was always there, lurking in the corners, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. One night, I woke to find it standing at the foot of my bed. It was closer than it had ever been before, its silhouette sharp and menacing against the dim glow of the lamp. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I just lay there, staring in horror, as it slowly leaned forward. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, its voice a low, rasping hiss. I bolted out of bed, knocking over the lamp in my panic, but by the time I turned around, the figure was gone. The room was empty, just as it always was, but I knew, deep down, that it had been real. I knew it was still watching me. That was the last night I spent in that apartment. I packed my things the next morning and left without looking back. I don't know what it was. A spirit, a ghost, a figment of my imagination. But I know that it didn't want me there. And I know that wherever I go, I can still feel its presence. Watching. Waiting. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced that I'm not alone. I'll hear the faintest sound, a creak, a whisper, a breath, and I'll lie there, holding my breath, waiting, because I know it's still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for me to be alone again. I've never had a problem living by myself. There's a sense of freedom in it, the ability to come and go as I please, to control my own space. I was used to it, or so I thought. The apartment I moved into was a modest one-bedroom unit on the second floor of an old brick building. The landlord had told me it had been vacant for a few years, but everything seemed in order, and the price was too good to pass up. I figured it was just the rundown appearance of the place that turned people off. My first few nights there were uneventful, just me getting settled and used to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the building. The place had character, I told myself. It felt like stepping into a different era. The tall windows, the old-fashioned moldings. It was charming in a way. I could see myself staying there for a while. But it was on the fourth night that things started to feel different. It was a chilly evening, and I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels with the TV casting a dim, flickering light across the room. I hadn't bothered to buy curtains yet, so the large window facing the street outside was bare, giving me a clear view of the darkened buildings across the road. That's when I saw him. A figure, standing in the window of the building directly opposite mine. He was still, unmoving, just a shadow against the dim glow of a single lamp. At first, I thought he was just another lonely tenant like me, staring out into the night. But there was something off about the way he stood, too rigid, too deliberate, almost as if he were posing. I shrugged it off and tried to focus on the TV, but every few minutes I found myself glancing back. He hadn't moved, just stood there facing my window, staring. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the dark outline of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his head slightly tilted as if watching me. It gave me the creeps. I turned off the TV, deciding to call it a night. But as I walked past the window to switch off the lights, I felt a strange compulsion to look again. He was still there, his silhouette framed perfectly in the window across the street. My heart skipped a beat. I lifted my hand slowly and waved, feeling foolish. He didn't respond, just stood there, motionless. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly turned off the light and hurried into the bedroom, telling myself I was overreacting. People stare out of windows all the time. It was probably just some guy zoning out, lost in thought. Still, I made a mental note to get curtains the next day. But the next evening, he was back. Same window, same unnerving stillness. It was like he hadn't moved at all since the night before. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. Every time I glanced over, he was there, head slightly cocked, staring. I considered calling the building across the street, asking if anyone lived in that unit, but I didn't even know who to contact. And besides, what would I say? Hey, there's a weird guy staring at me through his window? I'd sound paranoid. By the fifth night, I was actively avoiding the living room once it got dark. I didn't want to look out the window, didn't want to see him there again. But it was impossible to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. And then, just as I was about to head to bed, curiosity got the better of me. I edged towards the window and peeked out cautiously. He was gone. The window across the street was dark and empty, no sign of the figure. Relief flooded through me. Maybe he'd moved out. Maybe I'd been imagining things. I took a deep breath, feeling silly for letting it get to me. But as I turned away, something caught my eye. A reflection in the glass. I froze. He wasn't in the window across the street. He was in mine. A dark shape loomed behind me, impossibly close. I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. Just me and the flickering shadows cast by the TV. I backed away, my pulse roaring in my ears, eyes darting around the room. There was no one there, no sign of anyone having been there. I barely slept that night. Every creak, every rustle made my skin crawl. I kept imagining that shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed, watching me sleep. The next day, I bought heavy curtains and hung them up as soon as I got home. I kept them drawn tight, shutting out the window, shutting out the night. For a while, it seemed to work. I didn't see him. I didn't feel his eyes on me. But the unease never left. I started avoiding looking at my reflection, scared I'd see him standing behind me again. I stopped watching TV in the living room, choosing instead to hole up in my bedroom with the door locked. And then, a week later, the knocking started. It was soft at first, a gentle tapping on the window late at night. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but it grew louder, more insistent. Tap, 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 like fingernails rapping against the glass. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew he'd be there, waiting. But I couldn't help it. I threw back the covers and crept to the window, heart pounding. Slowly I pulled the curtain aside just an inch, just enough to peek out. His face was pressed against the glass, pale and expressionless. I stumbled back with a scream, the curtain falling shut. But the knocking continued, harder now, rattling the window in its frame. Tap, tap, tap. "Let me in," a voice whispered, muffled through the glass. I ran to the bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it, my hands shaking. The knocking followed me, echoing through the apartment, coming from every window, every wall. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, closer this time. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the blankets. It felt like hours before the knocking finally stopped, before the apartment fell silent again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother telling the landlord why. He wouldn't have believed me. I wouldn't have believed me. But as I turned in my keys and walked away from the building, I glanced up at the second-floor window one last time. He was there, standing in my window watching me leave. I'd always been a night owl, someone who preferred the quiet of the evening to the bustle of the day. So, when I found the perfect house, an old Victorian-style place in a sleepy town upstate, I couldn't resist. It was larger than what I needed, but the charm of the high ceilings, the intricate wooden details, and the sense of history it carried drew me in. I knew I'd be alone here. I wanted it that way. After years of chaotic city life, I craved solitude and the opportunity to start fresh. The house seemed like a sanctuary, but there was something about it I couldn't put my finger on, something that made me pause every now and then. The first few nights were quiet. I spent most of my time unpacking, exploring the many rooms, and getting to know the creaks and groans of the old house. It was a bit drafty, and the floorboards sometimes shifted underfoot, but that was to be expected from a building that had stood for over a century. But then, on the fourth night, I started to notice sounds. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling coming from somewhere in the walls. I figured it was mice. I'd lived in older buildings before. They all had their share of unwelcome critters. I set up a few traps and went to bed, assuming that would be the end of it. But the sounds didn't go away. They grew louder. One night, just after I'd settled into bed, I heard it again. A soft shuffling noise, like something moving slowly through the walls. I turned on my bedside lamp and listened intently. The sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Then it started again. This time closer, almost directly behind my headboard. I sat up, heart pounding, staring at the wall as if I could see through it. The noise was rhythmic, almost deliberate, a slow, scraping sound, followed by a soft thud. It reminded me of footsteps. I told myself it was just the pipes, or maybe the house settling, but something about it felt wrong. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I searched the house for any signs of rodents or structural issues, but found nothing. The walls were solid, no gaps or holes that could account for the noises. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid, but the sounds only got worse. A few nights later, I woke up to the distinct sensation of something moving in the room. I bolted upright, scanning the darkness. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, charged. I could feel my skin prickling, my pulse racing. And then I heard it. A whisper. It was so faint I almost missed it, just a soft, sibilant sound like breath passing over dry lips. I froze, straining to listen. The whisper came again, low and urgent, but I couldn't make out the words. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, near the old wardrobe I'd inherited with the house. I stared at the wardrobe, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to move, didn't want to turn on the light. I was scared of what I might see, but I couldn't just sit there, paralyzed by fear. Slowly, I reached for the lamp on my nightstand and flicked it on. The room flooded with soft yellow light, banishing the shadows. The whispering stopped instantly. The wardrobe stood there, dark and silent, its doors slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed that before. My mouth went dry. I told myself I must have left it like that, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. With trembling hands, I got up and walked over to it. My pulse roared in my ears. I gripped the door handle and yanked it open. Nothing, just empty shelves and a few hangers swaying gently. No sign of anyone, or anything, that could have been making that noise. I let out a shaky breath and shut the door firmly, making sure it clicked into place. But as I turned to go back to bed, I heard it again. Leave. A single word whispered so softly I almost thought I'd imagined it. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. I didn't sleep at all that night. Over the next few days, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just the wind, or a draft moving through the old walls. But that didn't explain the voices. It didn't explain the sensation that something was in the house with me, watching me. The whispering continued. Sometimes I'd hear it in the middle of the day, a faint murmur drifting through the house. Other times it would come at night, low and insistent, like someone standing right behind me. Get out. It was always the same, a command, urgent and forceful, but I didn't listen. I didn't want to leave. This was my house. I'd bought it. I was determined to make it work. But then things took a darker turn. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing through the house. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. They were coming from above me. From the attic. I didn't have an attic. Swallowing my fear, I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs. The sound of footsteps grew louder, reverberating through the ceiling. I stopped in front of a small door at the end of the hallway, a door I hadn't noticed before. It was a narrow wooden door set low into the wall, almost hidden behind a corner. I reached out, my hand shaking, and pushed it open. A narrow staircase led up into darkness. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something compelled me to keep going. Slowly I climbed the stairs, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The air grew colder as I ascended, and the darkness seemed to press in around me. At the top of the stairs, I found a small, dusty attic room. Moonlight filtered in through a single, grimy window, casting eerie shadows on the floor. The room was empty, save for an old, tattered armchair facing the window. But as I stepped closer, the flashlight beam flickering over the walls, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Words. They were scratched into the wood, covering every inch of the walls, floor, and ceiling. Dozens, maybe hundreds of words, all saying the same thing. Get out. My flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, I heard it again. Leave. The whisper was right next to my ear, cold and breathy. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the empty room and the scratched, desperate words. I ran. I stumbled down the stairs, barely able to see, panic clawing at my chest. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more frantic. Leave. 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 I burst out of the house and into the night, not stopping until I was halfway down the street. I stood there, gasping for breath, staring back at the dark, silent silhouette of the house. I never went back. I sold the place as quickly as I could, barely breaking even. I didn't care. I just wanted to be rid of it. I moved into a small apartment in the city, far away from that house and its whispering walls. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and still, I think I can still hear it. Leave.